This episode is made possible by our generous patrons.
Welcome to the Ink to Film podcast, where we read the book
And then see the movie.
I'm Luke.
And I'm James.
And this week we discussed Denis Johnson's 1992 short story collection, Jesus' Son. Happy Valentine's Day. You realize this episode's coming out on the 14th?
Yeah, I mean, now I do. It's pretty funny. It's a fitting project, right?
Yeah, it's such a romance, right?
Yep.
Yeah, we got a little off. We meant to do Silver Linings on this week, but I think we got off on our weeks, but whatever. What it is, though, is this is a collection of short stories that made me, partially is responsible for me falling in love with language and wanting to be a writer. I know I read it in college, so I was already well on the path, but I remember it just really strongly affected me when I read it. And so in that sense, it is a love story. It's me loving stories.
Just finishing this I guess collection of short stories, and I can completely see that. And because it's just like this experience reading a book that I've never really had before. Like there's been things that have been similar, but this was like such a very specific thing. In such a very specific voice.
Right. It's
poetic while also being like completely gruesome and horrific at times, and just like hard to read, and it's cool because it's like truth while also being surreal, and then it's also poetic. I don't know. It's crazy. It was a very interesting.
There's a lot of like really funny parts in this book too, which is weird to say sometimes because it's so dark. It's really dark comedy at times.
Yeah. There's something about like how like incoherent it is. Like it's like on purpose, and it's like it's like the stream of consciousness. Even trying to formulate something, it just like it blows my mind that he was able to write something and have it be so scatterbrained, kind of like an addict or like someone who's using would be, while also, like I said, being so poetic and so like well written and presented.
Well, we'll get into his bio a little bit here in a minute, which I think is interesting. But you won't be surprised to hear that he does write poetry as well, because this guy can really, nail a sentence. He's one of those writers that I just stop every page or two and just am in awe of some sentence he wrote and go, oh my God, I could spend my entire career chasing a sentence like that. It's wild.
And sometimes it's like, I'm thinking that this is from the perspective of our narrator. And it's like, is our narrator describing these things in this capacity, or is it just like maybe he's able to see these things, but not necessarily? Because it seems to me that like the narrator wouldn't necessarily be able to describe things in this kind of detail, but we as the readers seeing through his eyes are, and maybe that's something to do with like his drug addiction or something like that. Okay,
so it sounds to me like you're trying to separate or figure out how separate the author is from the narrator?
Oh, not necessarily. I just mean that like it seems to me that the prose is more. It's at a level that I wouldn't expect the narrator to kind of go to. You know what I mean? Like I don't necessarily think that he would be thinking this intellectually.
There's some stuff about that loosely about that you might find interesting, but we'll get to it in a minute. Before we do, though, I wanted to announce to our listeners who might be like, this is kind of a weird project. I don't know about this. This is sort of a like passion project of mine. Like I said, this guy's a writer's writer. I would call him. If you've been in like MFA programs and you've been around a lot of this kind of stuff, like you probably know about him. How widely popular he is outside of that world, I don't really know. There is a movie, obviously that's why we're covering it. And I think it did okay, but I do believe it was considered like an indie movie at the time. But for those of you who listen for like the more mainstream stuff, we wanted to go ahead and announce we're doing Game of Thrones season 1 after this project is over. So make sure to check that out. It's gonna be very exciting, because that is another huge project for me, because George R.R. Martin and that book series is one of the reasons that I write fantasy and write speculative genre fiction in general.
Game of Thrones, and we all know how big of a phenomenon it is, and like we're excited for the finale that's coming here soon. So we really wanted to like relive it and do it with the audience. So it'll be fun.
We thought it'd be cool to go back and revisit, like the origin. So if you haven't seen season 1 and whatever 7 or 8 years it is now, and and you just want to kind of go back and relive the early days, it should be a lot of fun. So definitely check that out. But yeah, man, I just wanted to talk to you more about your general thoughts on this, because you said like this isn't really the sort of thing you read.
No,
I will say this is like, now this is a very good example, but this is like kind of a taste of modern literary writing in a way that I think a lot of people aren't exposed to. And when a lot of people think of literature, they think of like stuff that was written in the 1800s as being literature, you know? And like that stuff is too, but that's more like classic literature. And this is more contemporary. Now this was written in the 90s, so it's I'm sure it's moved on, you know, it's, actually almost 30 years ago now.
It's about as old as me.
Yeah, man. I don't know, what was it like reading something like this, and how did it compare to like everything else we've read?
Well, I mean, comparison to everything we've read, it's completely different, and but I can see like why you wanted us to do it, because it's so purely from like a, I can see that he's like one of the Mount Rushmores maybe potentially of like this sort of fiction, and it makes me, for my own personal life, it makes me, and I've talked about this on the podcast before, but it makes me think of like creative writing classes that I've taken in college and things like that weren't necessarily in my major, but I wanted to take to kind of like flesh out my education. So like when I've said this story before, but briefly, when I went into the creative writing class for the first class, it was a fiction writing class. And so I was like, oh, this will be really fun. I'll get to write some fiction. This is the type of fiction that everybody else in the class was trying to write. And I was trying to write like very genre specific fiction for the first like week or two. And then I wised up and started trying to.
I think we talked about this in episode 1 of this podcast. Isn't that funny? Here we are, episode 76. This is going to be, I think. 76 episodes later. Yeah, exactly. I shared that I had a similar experience where at my school I was at, they didn't like genre either. But this shows that like you can write really interesting stuff like this, but it's hard because often people aren't exposed to this sort of thing until they arrive in those classes. So then it's like, here's a thing that you've never been exposed to. Now we're trying to write something like that. Like, that's tough.
Well,
that's a tall order.
It's just like it's like I think for a lot of general audiences, when you hear fiction, you think like fantastical worlds, or you think like something like very, very fiction. But you can have something that's grounded in, right? You can have something that's grounded in real life, and just a story that you're telling that it doesn't have any just, it just has human elements to it. So I feel like that opened my eyes up to this kind of stuff. And then a lot of the stuff we read in those classes were in the same vein, but that's why I feel like I had an appreciation for this, is just having that like little tiny background in that. And then going into this, I was just blown away. There's just the sheer, like the weight of these stories, like each one, I had to take a breather in between each one. And it was just like, they're heavy, while also being like so densely well written. And it's not like dense in the way that it's like hard to read through, but it's just like, there's so much subtext, or there's so much, there's the plot of what's going on in these stories, and then there's also like another plot going on where he's like laying subtext for some sort of other like moral story that he's trying to tell, or something like that.
Yeah, man. So I wrote down, it's like trying to eat 10 filet mignons in a row. That's what these stories are like. Filet mignons of sadness. It's like they're delicious. It's great. But it's so like rich and hearty, and you just want to savor it. And so it's really hard to just power through this book, even though it's super short compared to a lot of the other stuff we've read. So yeah, I mean, I agree. It's a really, I mean, it's weird because it's so sad, and like it definitely feels kind of soul crushing at times while you're reading it. This book is filled with existential dread and angst, and that can be a bit oppressive to certain people, I guess, and to me too, but I also sort of enjoy it. And so I do recommend this book to people. If you wanted to give like contemporary literature a taste, because there's also a lot of just like exciting stuff that happens in here too. Like it's not dry at all. Like this is about a fucked up guy, literally called Fuckhead is his nickname. And he's a drug addict, and he just like goes through life, and crazy shit happens to him and around him, and he does crazy shit, and we just kind of follow his life. And I don't know, it's just really fascinating.
Something about each story too is that it feels like while you're reading it, it feels important. Like each story, like it feels like an important thing to read and an important perspective, even though it's not necessarily from like some like actual life experiences or anything like that. It's like, it just feels like because he's giving us as the readers this perspective, we're able to I think, empathize and sympathize with people who are addicts a little more, and then not to mention, like, it feels important just because of the way that he's writing. You can just tell that this is somebody who's respected in his field and is bringing something like really special. So I have a couple of things that just like came to me while reading this. How familiar are you with David Lynch's films?
Not, I thought I was more familiar than I am, because I actually like reviewed like a discography of him at some point and like read down the list and realized I don't even know if I've seen any of them. I might have seen like one.
So he is such an interesting filmmaker because he does this thing where
he also did Twin Peaks, right?
Yeah, he did Twin Peaks.
Yeah, so I've only seen like 2 or 3 episodes of that, but that might be the only David Lynch I've actually seen.
There's something that's been coined about him. There's like Lynchian. He has like a Lynchian kind of style to him. And a lot of these stories were bringing that to me. And it's kind of like this sort of like absurdist, surreal, like you're not supposed to really understand what's going on. But at the same time, like if you like reread it or rewatch it or like kind of try to understand it a little more, there's more to it. And it's like there's like things going on that are normal and abnormal. Things that are abnormal begin to seem normal. It's like really hard to explain, but basically this felt very like Lynchian to me, and it felt creative in like a totally different way than I think a lot of other people can even like think, you know what I mean? I don't know a lot of people that like can even go to this space to write something like this.
Well, like Lynch, I mean, from what I understand, just from what I know about him, it seems like would you say it's fair to say he's influenced many directors who've come after him? And
for sure. I mean, I was just watching a Yorgos Lanthimos film, which he did like The Lobster and like The Killing of a Sacred Deer.
The Favorite?
And The Favorite, yeah.
Yeah.
He's definitely influenced by David Lynch. Just like that sort of like, it's just this style, it's just this tone and the style and the way that like each one has their own style of that kind of thing, but it's like that absurdist kind of surreal.
So I don't know if you're familiar with who Raymond Carver is, or does that name sound familiar to you?
No, I'm not familiar.
So he's a pretty well-known short story, and I think he wrote novels too. I'm not like an expert in Raymond Carver, but I've read some of his stuff, and I really enjoyed it. And we're about to get into bio, but Denis Johnson attended the Iowa MFA writer's workshop, which for literary workshops is considered the top workshop in the nation. And while he was there, he was like one of his professors was Raymond Carver. So he's considered kind of a disciple of Raymond Carver. How overstated or understated that, is, I don't know. And then he's gone on to...
Well, it's always cool to see like the lineage, yeah.
Right. And then he's gone on to influence like a whole generation of writers who've come after from this book, that was written in the early 90s.
I just can't even like begin to understand, because it's like, how do you take yourself to these places, and how do you like, you're supposed to, subvert expectations, but it's like there are no expectations. Like you can't even expect any of these things that are going on.
Well, you have none of the trappings of genre to fall back on, which is scary when you try and write this sort of stuff. We're about to get into the bio stuff, but this stuff is semi-biographical, autobiographical, I should say.
Oh, really?
Yeah. He said much of this happened to him. Some of it happened to people he knew, but like his nickname was Fuckhead when he was in his 20s and a drug addict. So it was
very close to him. I thought it was more like this like removed artist writing something that he didn't know, but he was like in it.
So this reminds me of the collection of short stories. Now, I've also heard them called story cycles. I don't know how official a term that is, but I kind of like it. So maybe I'll call it a story cycle. But they're like they're like linked short stories, but they do each kind of stand on their own. That's how this book is. There's another one that I absolutely love called The Things They Carried, which is about the Vietnam War. But that is a similar book because it's autobiographical, but it's also fiction because it's like not all about him. He uses other people's stories, and then he like changes some stuff and changes the dates on things and shifts things around to make it thematically interesting and to make like a certain point with what he's trying to tell. So it's like it's kind of real, kind of fiction that then becomes fiction because it can't be half untrue and then still be called nonfiction. So right. And then it's all blurry lines, and then he says it's also like really like fuzzy memory, so some of it he doesn't even know what was real and what wasn't, and I think that all reflects. And
wow, that like kind of I have to reread the whole novel because like that totally changes my perspective on everything.
So before we we're going to get into more specifics after we do bio, but even before that, I have a lot of ideas that were occurring to me. Now, this is my second time reading it, and then I've read certain stories like Car Crash While Hitchhiking and Emergency in particular, like many other times. Like I think I've read Emergency probably like 8 or 10 times now.
Can we say that that's your favorite one, or do you not like to pick favorites? Because I feel like that might have been my favorite as well.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think it's safe to say that's the most famous story from this collection. I'll be interested to see, because it seems to me like, from what I know of the movie, it's like the linchpin of the movie. But I'm curious how much of this other stuff is in the movie. Neither of us have seen it, so we'll find out.
Yeah, that's another whole other thing. I don't even know how you adapt this.
Well, okay, I'm gonna put you on the spot at the end of the episode, because I want to ask you how you would go about, or how you can try and imagine adapting this book into a movie. So maybe be kind of thinking about that. But I think this question I'm about to ask you actually might kind of help in that, along those lines. This time I was reading it, I was trying to figure out what makes this like a cohesive book. What links these stories other than character? Like, obviously it's the same person, but I'm thinking like thematic. I'm thinking about like the point it's trying to make, that kind of stuff. And I know that's a big question, but was any of that stuff running through your head that you felt like there was some sort of message behind this book that you could pick up on?
I mean, I feel like there's a lot, but to say one specific one, clearly I think he's trying to humanize addiction. Like, I think that he's trying to bring it to a more attainable level for people, because, you know, you'll see an addict and like know that somebody's using and see them as like violent or dangerous, and like they very well could be, but at the same time it's like they're struggling with something that's like, basically now that they've started it, it's almost out of their control, and it's like coming back from that is really hard. I feel like that would be like the obvious through line.
Well, let me examine that a little bit. So I think one of the ways he does that, and I agree that he does that, is to show addiction through our narrator, at least, as being almost a coping mechanism for him, in my opinion, for sort of like the absurdity of life. It's like he's giving away, to me it felt like he was giving away control constantly to the drugs, because he didn't want to be in control of his own life. And I think it was partly because of like the tragedy that was always surrounding him. And I think it felt safer for him if it was just like, I'm not in control anymore, now the drug is. And then it also just like, there's also a little bit of that like seeking meaning. It feels to me like our narrator is looking for meaning throughout this book, whether it's like from the divine or from drugs or from sex or from nature itself. There's all sorts of things we see him sort of turning to throughout these stories. To me, it felt like he really wanted to find a purpose and find, you know, sometimes we see him doing things that are heroic, and often we see him are somewhat heroic, and then other times we see him being like completely reprehensible. And it's almost like he's just experimenting different things and trying to figure out who he is and like where he fits into this fucked up world. And then he's surrounded himself with people who are kind of doing the same thing. And so then all that stuff becomes framed, in my opinion, in that same light. It's like everybody's just trying to figure out how to live. And then we see all these relationships between these people are totally fucked up. But they're also like some of the most memorable, happy moment, like memories they have. But then we see so many of these relationships, I'm talking about like romantic relationships, they always go terribly wrong. So it's like, and it's the same thing with the drugs. Like, obviously that's leading to tragedy. And so it's like this trap that he's in, searching for meaning or something, and, you know, maybe going to the wrong places for it. I don't know.
So you just kind of had rattled some stuff in my brain and made me start thinking about something. Obviously the story is called Jesus' Son, right?
Right.
And like, I think there's like you were kind of touching on some of the reasons why it could be Jesus' son. Like the idea that Christ or Jesus was this person, like in the biblical sense, somebody who died for sins. It's like you're going around and sinning and seeing if you can find forgiveness through that. And it's like we have the ability to sin because of Jesus' death is like that perspective. And so it's like Jesus' son is like basically the person who comes after sin has been forgiven, if you like look for the path through Jesus. And that also brings up an interesting point of religion that I kept seeing popping up in interesting ways. And honestly, because of the title going in, I kind of thought that there would be religious undertones, but I kept picking up on like maybe even really, really subtle ones where it was like, somebody would just use like Jesus as like an expletive, where they'd be like, Jesus, what are you doing, or something like that.
Well, there's a moment in Emergency where he thinks he sees an angel like through the snow, and he starts like, he like talks about how he's going to shit him. He almost shit himself. He was so afraid of it, right? But then it ends up not being that.
Yeah. Well, how about and then in the car crash?
Oh yeah.
And in car crash, he has like the moment of like when she's the wife is finding out about the husband, I believe. And she's like the room is like glowing, and she's like screaming, and he's hearing like otherworldly things, and
we never know like what's drugs and what's something else, right? Like, so that's that blurring that line, because we also know he's on drugs throughout all of these stories. So, and he's on like often like LSD or like, you know, hallucinogens or whatever, and so who knows what's going on in his head. And to me, that's kind of the through line through all of it. And it, if you look at it through that lens, it's interesting because I think there is sort of an arc for the character by the end. All right, so I think let's go ahead and get into bio for Denis. Denis Hale Johnson was born July 1st, 1949. He died in May 24th of 2017. So just a couple years ago. I actually think I do remember hearing about this. Yeah, he was only 67. So he was fairly young. Liver cancer.
Oh, wow. I actually like didn't know what year the book came out. I didn't look at it when I started reading it, and I didn't know the age of this person. And for some reason, I thought that it was like I thought it was like mid 2000s book, but written by a younger man.
Right. No. So the early stories, I believe, are supposed to be set in like the late 70s, early 80s.
Because he talks about Vietnam a little bit here and there, right?
Right. Yeah. Because Vietnam had just happened when he was in his 20s, I guess, or was happening around that time. Yeah. He is most famous for this collection of short stories. He has also written a novel called The Tree of Smoke, which won the National Book Award for Fiction. So also well known for that. He's written plays, poetry, journalism, and nonfiction as well. And he just had another collection of short stories that was published posthumously that just came out, I think, earlier this last year, I believe. Now, he was a recluse in life, famously so. Didn't agree to do hardly any appearances, did very few interviews, was just not really a public figure. Now, occasionally he'd come out and he'd teach like a semester at like the Iowa workshop. And it must have been incredible to be in one of those classes because it was he was not on faculty. It was just like every now and then he'd come and do a semester. I was able to find some of the interviews he did. There was 2 major interviews, and my notes got a little scrambled, and I'm not sure what came from which interview. So what I'll do is I'll put links to both interviews in the show notes if you want to see the full interviews. But there's a couple things in these interviews that I think is really interesting, because like literally that's all the bio I have, other than like stuff I picked up from interviews that I read. But some of this stuff I thought was really interesting, just to sort of like set the table for us getting into more detail. So the interviewer asks, do you see your first-person narrators, fuckhead namely, as having written the stories themselves? And his response, voice, I don't think of it as under my control. I like Fuckhead's voice. I liked it the minute I heard it, and I enjoy its doubleness. He seems to be immersed in his era, and then also looking back on it from years afterward. But that's all I can tell you about that. When I was an undergrad, I took courses from the poet Marvin Ball, who said, don't be committed to one voice. I don't remember if he said it once or if he said it often, but it stuck with me and I stick by it. I try to forget what I've already written and forget what it sounded like and treat each attempt as if it were my very first. Which, to me, like, I've read a lot of, like, authors talking about stuff, and this was something sort of fresh to me. I'd never really heard this. Because a lot of times people talk about, like, you'll develop a voice over time, and that'll become what you're known for, and it'll be in all your work and all this stuff. Whereas he's sort of dismissing voice a little bit and saying that he tries to approach everything in, like, a fresh way with a new voice, which is, I don't know how possible that is, but it's interesting that he approaches things that way.
I can understand a new perspective and a new way of writing like a character from a different background or something like that. But to just fully change your voice, like especially from this, there's no way. If he wrote something else, I would know it was him. You know what I mean?
You'd think, yeah. All right, so here's another one I thought was interesting. You've discussed with critics how your work trades in spiritual themes. How would you characterize the theological questions you ask about religion or God in your work? Have these questions changed over time? His response, now, this is a question I've learned to run from, and it's the chief reason I avoid giving interviews. If I've discussed these things in the past, I shouldn't have. I'm not qualified. I don't know who God is or any of that. People concerned with those questions turn up in my stories, but I can't explain why they do. Sometimes I wish they wouldn't.
if he doesn't want to talk about it and he's that far, it's because he himself struggles with it on a daily basis, or did struggle with it, I'm sure.
I mean, it's interesting, right? Like this interesting kind of evasion of an answer, but in and of itself, it is an answer too, right? Because it's so, that's right for his characters who are searching for meaning, and clearly he is too. And he doesn't want to, I don't think he wants to pin it down, because I think it can rob some of the mystique of the story if you start to lay it all out. Now, I believe this is from a different interview. So the questioner is asking him about going back and rereading the stories of Jesus' son. And they say, what did you feel towards them when you read them, even if you would sit down and read them by yourself? And he says, well, I don't know. I rarely read them to myself, but reading them out loud, I really enjoyed the humor in them. People would almost always come up to me afterwards and say, I didn't realize those were funny. I thought those stories were just sad. When you read them out loud, people laugh a lot because the characters are humorous. It's just their situations are generally very, very bleak. And I think that's true. I think often, like, I have to almost step back a little bit and think about how, like, it is actually pretty funny. And then I can totally see that if you're in a room full of people and he's reading the stories out loud, there's probably a lot of laughs for a lot of the crazy shit that happens in it, you know?
The way that he writes these characters and these stories in this specific collection here, he's writing it as it would happen in real life. It's not like there's no plot really, right? It's just like wherever the wind blows these characters, whatever happens. I think it's like laughing from absurdity. Like
there's some genuinely funny moments though that we can talk about as they come up. But
but I feel like he's, by saying that he didn't mean to write it as funny, like clearly he was like infusing some humor, just because I think that that's part of stories.
Oh no, like, I think he may have meant for it to be funny, but I think a lot of people who are reading it like in the quiet of their own home maybe don't recognize the humor of it all the time, and it's not until they're in a room full of people laughing and they go, "Oh, that was supposed to be funny."
Okay, yeah, I get you.
So one other thing, I won't read the full question, but basically they compare him to some other famous authors and talk about him being really influential. And one he agrees with is he says that he was influenced by The Catcher in the Rye, and that was like one of his favorite books growing up.
That's one of my favorite books.
Yeah, he feels like in a similar way that this is a story of what he called the journey of a youthful soul. So there's really not a lot. There's those couple interviews he gave. I was looking for him on YouTube to see him, like, oh, did you do any like recorded interviews? Not really. I could find some readings he did at like different MFAs and stuff, MFA programs, videos with like 50 views and stuff. It's wild, but it's out there if you want to look for it. But really, he was a pretty reclusive guy who just didn't do a lot of public appearances. Oh, and in one of the interviews, they were talking to him about his home in Idaho. He had like 120 acres out in Idaho, and he was just like out in the middle of nowhere and like kind of on his 120 acres.
Yeah, as much as selfishly, I would have liked there been like more interviews, but I think having some of that mystery like adds to the stories, while also it makes me feel good that like I kind of feel like he got to live the life he wanted to live. If he wanted to be a recluse and not have to deal with the public eye and everything, it sounds like he succeeded.
Well, and it's, I'm sure he's never really said like, this is true that happened to me and this was in fiction. You know what I mean? Like, but clearly a lot of this stuff actually happened. I read in his bio that he was on his third wife when he died. So we know the character in the book definitely talks about being married once, maybe twice. I was unclear. So clearly I think he's had a very fraught romantic history throughout his life, and it's really interesting because it's like, if a lot of this stuff is true, then holy shit, some of the stuff this guy lived through.
I mean, yeah. I mean, we're gonna get into some of the little details here in a second, but just think about like if Crash While Hitchhiking is real, like that's like the most traumatic thing that ever happens to you, and like and then everything that follows is also right there with it. It's crazy. Yeah, it's been through a lot.
Well, I mean, you talked about it, so I think it's time. We get into it. So you have a little description for each one of these you were gonna read, just to kind of set the stage. We're gonna go through. We won't go like real in depth into the plot. So we'll set the stage, and then we'll just talk about each story briefly, and we're gonna try and move through them all. So like we could have done an episode for each story in this book, like very easily, but we decided that might have been a bit much, so we're going to try and get through it here.
Yeah, I think this is the point where we should say that if you haven't read this book, you should definitely check it out, because we're not going to do it justice by these little blurbs, and then and like we're definitely going to talk about the details. So if you do read it, you can come back and kind of have that knowledge of these stories and get it more out of it.
we're trying to set the table so that like if you read this but it's been a while, like you can remember, oh, they're talking about that one story where this happens.
Okay, so car crash while hitchhiking. My little blurb here is a hitchhiker on drugs gets a ride from a family. He has a vision of them getting into a crash and then it happens.
It's this story, man, right out of the gates. It is such a gut punch to me. It's so sad and so beautiful too, and I thought it was really interesting how he has this sleeping bag draped over his shoulders like a cape, which I thought was an interesting sort of image, as he's this like clearly not a hero, and the way he's behaving is not heroic, but it kind of is because he also has the baby. So yeah, he's like hitchhiked with a family, but he like has this premonition that they're gonna get in a car crash, and then they do, and then it's just like it's crazy, it's chaos, right?
I didn't even make the cape connection. That's cool. I like that. But the interesting thing to me is that he doesn't say anything about it. He just accepts it, and he's in the car too. So like he could potentially have gotten killed or hurt, and he's just like, we're gonna get in a wreck and whatever. I'm gonna lean my head against the side of the car and just let it happen. And then he's just like
somehow miraculously unscathed, though it seems like.
Yeah. And so is the baby, which is also amazing. I thought they were gonna make it out, and there was gonna be some larger story of. Because I was immediately thinking that there was going to be religious stuff, so I thought there was going to be some miracle that happens. But it's kind of the opposite in a way. There are miracles, but at the same time, there's this tragedy.
Yeah, I mean, and so he kind of walks through the destruction, and he sees a man splayed out near death, like very near death, unconscious, like snoring, I think. He says he's like snoring rudely or something, which is such a crazy way to describe it. And then he just like keeps walking on. He has the baby in his arms, and then like a semi has pulled over, and he gets in with the guy who's in there, and they're just like sitting there together watching it and just like waiting for something to happen. I don't know. It's like this bizarre thing where you want them to like do something. I don't know.
Yeah.
But you can also see like they're in shock, clearly, right? Like everybody's in shock.
And so the cops come and basically they say like you need to go to the hospital, and they take everybody to the hospital. And then he gets there and kind of like sees the fallout of like the husband when they loaded the husband up into the ambulance and everything. He was like basically like there's no way that they're gonna make it, that he's gonna make it. And then they like by the time they get there, I believe he's died.
So there's a line, and I can't remember it specifically, but the gist of it was that there was like a tragedy of the man is clearly dreaming, and our narrator can't tell our narrator he's like what he's dreaming, and then like our narrator can't tell him that he is dreaming.
Right.
Does this sound familiar to you? Do you remember that line? Am I getting it close?
Yeah.
I don't think I've ever talked about this in the podcast, but I was in a really severe car accident myself about 10 years ago, and I was in a coma for about, I don't know, a week and a half after it happened. And I have a lot of crazy memories of like weird dreams and being in and out of consciousness, and like reality sort of being blurred between dreaming about what happened and then like what actually happened, and then forgetting what happened and all this stuff. And so when I was reading about this stuff, like to me, it connected with me very strongly, and it reminded me of that.
Yeah. I mean, I was thinking of you during the story, man. I would just it's a miracle that you're even here on the podcast right now. So like read this car crash story is also really crazy. And I was thinking about you. So,
you know, what's crazy is the first time I read this book was before I was in the accident too. So that happened after. So it's kind of creepy actually. Because wow. that sets the tone for the entire book, because it's about the crazy randomness of tragedy that's possible in life, all the absurdity of it. And like a lot of philosophers have talked about this, like I know like Sartre and Camus and all these existentialists have talked about this sort of thing, and they have different, in Nietzsche, and they have different like ways that they feel like, you know, you can handle it. And one of them is to turn to drugs and to just try and like get every ounce of like enjoyment you can get out of life while you have it, because that's what you should do in the face of absurd tragedy that can strike at any moment. And some of them live their lives that way. That's sort of like, you know, like drug addicts and what have you. And you know, obviously I'm not saying I necessarily adhere to that, but this book to me kind of embodies that thinking in a sense, because I feel like our narrator, that's his reaction to this shit, to double down on drugs and escape, and trying to like escape it.
So I was not sure until like the second story or actually maybe even the third story, that all of these stories were going to be from the perspective of the same person.
Mm-hmm. Well, he's totally unnamed for like half the book. And then only then we get the nickname, the fuckhead nickname. That's it.
Yeah, and then there's also evidence, I would say, I don't have any specifics right here, but I would say that there's also evidence that sometimes it doesn't seem like the same person.
Well, and it's interesting because we heard that he has said that some of this stuff is stories people told him. Oh, that was the other thing he said. So this was all, he would tell people these stories over the years. Mm-hmm. And people would always tell him, like, you should write this stuff down. And he kept feeling like, no, I just told you it. I don't need to write it down. And so, like, years went by of him just telling these stories over and over to people until he finally sat down and, like, wrote it all down. And he said he wrote down, like, several of these stories on the same day, I think is what I read, which seems crazy to me. If some of this stuff was actually somebody else, maybe that's why it feels that way. I don't know.
Maybe, yeah. The other thing is that I don't think that there's really evidence to say that this is in chronological order, any of these stories. So it's like we don't really know necessarily where it's happening unless he gives us specific details about like where he's at, what age he is, or like year-wise. We can't even place it sometimes. So like I don't know that these are in order.
This came up in the interview. He said that Car Crash While Hitchhiking is chronologically the earliest story. And then the final story, which I'm drawing a blank on the name of it right now, but that is chronologically the last story. And then he said in between it is roughly chronological with some changes. Originally he had the entire book completely out of order. But I think his editor pushed him to try and make it a little more chronological because he thought it would progress more as like an overarching story that way.
Well, I feel like that would adhere to like the like how incoherent it is if it was just all over the place anyway. But yeah, those are just two thoughts I had. Let's get back to Car Crash real quick. So at the end, there's this line that I just like I'm still trying to figure out what it means to me. So I wanted to ask you. It's at the end. So the wife realizes that the husband's dead, and she goes into the room with the doctor, and like he talks about the screaming and how he like would be chasing that screaming for his whole life. And he talks about how like there's like this super harsh light from the office that they're in or whatever. But then it goes to him saying, "It was raining. Gigantic ferns leaned over us. The forest drifted down a hill. I could hear a creek rushing down among rocks. And you ridiculous people, you expect me to help you."
Yeah, and to me that so this particular story, I think, was sort of that, like I was talking about with the sleeping bag. He's set up as being in a position where he could be more heroic than he has been. Like we keep thinking like, okay, you're there, you're clearly not hurt. So your job right now in this moment is to get everybody out of the wrecks, is to like start doing CPR, is to do everything you can to help these people, right? But this guy is fucked up on drugs. He himself is like just a fucked up person, and clearly he's not the kind of person to do that. And we're learning that about him in this moment, I think. And I do love that this story is sort of told in like that, like, and it breaks that fourth wall every now and then, and the narrator speaks to us, the reader.
Well, I took it to be like recounting tales,
right? And then yeah, that scream, just to speak to that reminded me of the scene in Fight Club where, do you remember Tyler Durden threatens this guy with death about like how he's going to come and kill him if he doesn't go to school and like chase his dreams and all that stuff, right?
Right.
And then after he lets the guy go, he says that like, oh, you know, his breakfast is going to be the best breakfast he's ever tasted tomorrow, and like all this stuff, right? Like he's going to feel more alive than ever. Well, in this situation, to me, the wife's scream is like such a powerful emotion, and it's so true, and it shows loss and love and everything else. That to him, like, I think he's kind of in search of like authentic life experiences throughout this. And so I think that is like so pure that's what to me, that's what he meant when he said, like, I've been searching for that scream ever since.
I like that. Yeah.
Well, let's move on because we got a lot of stories to get through.
Okay. So for two men, this is my little short synopsis here. Leaving a dance, a mute man jumps in the narrator's car and they drive to multiple locations being guided by him. After finally dropping him off, they see another man that sold them bad cocaine and they give chase.
Yeah, so this is a a wild story. And to me, this shows like this is something where in story craft they talk about setting up the status quo. And to me, this is the status quo we learned for his life. Like, this is what like the average day looks like for him.
Right.
He's rolling around with other addicts. They're doing crazy stuff. There's a guy who may or may not actually be mute. It's there's like a chase where the guy's chasing after the car, and then he runs into a stop sign. It's wild. And then he himself is threatening somebody. He's chasing somebody because they sold him bad drugs. And we could just see his life is like out of control in this moment, this point in his life, right? To me, that's what this story served. I think if I had read all of these stories not knowing they were part of a collection and just viewing them each as independent stories, I think this is one of the ones I would have liked the least, because it didn't feel like, I mean, it was just kind of a slice of life, I guess, which could be okay.
Well, a bunch of them are like that too. A bunch of them end up being slightly.
I agree with that. Yeah. But to me, this one was like the most like that. I don't know. Just for whatever reason, this was one that I wasn't like, because I was really into that first one. This one was one of the weaker ones for me, while still being very good, and obviously still having a lot of really excellent sentences and really excellent prose in there. Yeah. I wasn't as like compelled by this one.
So this one for me was, I'm working through it, and I'm trying to like understand what's going on, because so far it's just been the car crash. Like, this is my experience.
Yeah.
And
this is the next thing you get. Yeah.
This is the next thing I get, and so I'm like, what's going on here? Who is this new narrator? Is this? And then I'm trying to piece together if this is the same narrator. And I just felt like this entire thing was even more than the first story, just full stream of consciousness. Like, whatever's happening is happening, and it felt like to me, it felt like what you think of when you're awake, what your dreams are like. So it just felt like a dream. Like, it's like you're walking to your car and a mute man jumps in your car, and then like he's telling you where to go, and you're going to all these places, and then like you go into a room and they're talking about stuff that you don't really like. What does this have to do with anything else that's going on? That's how this story felt to me. It's just like, what does any of this mean?
And that goes back to that. To me, this feels like it's interesting, because it almost feels like he doesn't have agency in the story, which is such a, so anathema for what we're taught for storytelling. You want your characters to be driving the action.
Right.
But so much of this feels like he's being swept up by drugs. He's being swept up by the people he's with, and he gets caught up in these things, and he doesn't act so often. Like, he doesn't do anything. He's just kind of there.
And then the way that this story ends, like, I was trying to figure out if we had like if this was a new narrator, like how unreliable this guy was, because clearly he was unreliable because all this crazy stuff was going on. But then at the end, he like runs in and he's like asking where this guy, he chased a guy into a house, and then he's asking where that guy is, and then the woman is saying that guy is gone, and he's in like out on vacation or something. And it's like, okay, so who was he even chasing? Like, was that just the drugs? That's when I started realizing, like, oh, okay, this is all connected by the same characters and threads.
Yeah, and honestly, it is. I think it is sort of up to interpretation, like what is actually going on beneath all the, like through all the drugs and everything, like what the actual truth is. I don't know.
All right, so out on bail, the narrator drinks with Jack Hotel, and then they get fucked up. Jack dies and the narrator lives.
Yeah, but I actually really like this story. Now I think it was pretty short. Like, if it was standalone, I think it would be almost Flash. But I thought it was excellent, because it was these two guys who are in very similar places in their lives, and it's like they're having this like buddy moment. They're having that like, we're getting fucked up together, and we're enjoying life together, and we're in a similar place, and we're doing it for similar reasons. And then they go too far, but they're both like fully in on it. Like, they want to do this, and they take a ton of drugs, and then I believe heroin. They go home, and he just basically like very states it that he went home, overdosed, and the people he was with at the time like woke him up and saw to it. Like, I forget what they did, but they basically saw to it that he didn't die, and were able to keep him alive. His friend, who he was hanging out with, same thing. He went home, and he it was similar to something that happens in a later story, but basically he had his like significant other that he thought was going to be able to take care of him, and then that didn't happen, and then he died. And then, the story ends with, like, he died and I'm still alive, basically. And to me, that was, again, like, that absurdity, that, like, randomness in life. And, like, it very easily, like, literally flip of the coin, it could have been him.
So you get the sense that he's grateful to be alive, at least. Like, he's like, oh, that sucks that Jack died, but I'm alive. is kind of what I got out of it.
I didn't know if I thought grateful as I thought more like just stating a fact.
Statement.
Like, I lived. He died and I lived.
Yeah, I think you might be right there, but for I think why I came to that conclusion was just earlier in the story they were having such a great time together, being alive, and like part of that like joyous occasion, like the side effect of that is like somebody might die. So then his friend died, and he's like, I think it's like his friend dies, and I just took it to mean like, okay, I'm still alive. But basically what I'm trying to say is that when he says I'm still alive, I got the sense that like he's not going to stop using, he's going to continue to abuse, and like tomorrow he might not be alive.
So it didn't change his life or anything. But yeah, I do think there's a little bit of survivor's guilt in there. Like it's just another thing that for him to feel bad about. Mm-hmm. I think he almost feels bad that he's the one who survived.
Right.
Or he recognizes that he didn't deserve to be alive. He just happened to survive that night and the other guy didn't. Yeah. It really interesting. I mean, like, God, like we could go through the story and just do a whole episode about it and just like talk about everything that happens in it. There's so much there. Like there's so much like just rich storytelling in every one of these that you could get nitty gritty and talk about lines. You know, we could spend 20 minutes on a paragraph. And I kind of wish we could do that. It doesn't really fit our format. So let's move on to the next one.
All right, Dun Dun. My synopsis is it's about an accident caused by drugs. They shot a guy and then were too messed up to drive. And then, so basically they're using, everybody is in like this barn, I believe they're using, and then somebody gets shot and then they try to take him to the hospital but wreck the car, and then our narrator comes in and wants to be the hero and save the day and drive the car to the hospital, and then the guy who was shot dies on the way.
And man, there's an exchange in here that I do need to read verbatim. But yeah, the guy who's been shot throughout, it's like they're trying to figure out if they need to help him and how serious is it, and he seems to be okay, and it's unclear. And they're the two guys who are talking as our narrator and another character, both out of their minds on drugs. One of them's already crashed his car earlier in the story. Mm-hmm. It was like holding up a shed now, I think it was described. Then they have to take the narrator's car, and they're going to take this guy to get him seen. Here, I'm going to read some of this verbatim. So they're talking to him. Do you promise not to tell them anything? Dun Dunn was talking to McInnes. So McInnes is the guy who got shot. Dun Dunn is the other guy who's with them, the other drug addict.
Who did the shooting.
And I don't think he hears you, I said. I is the narrator. Tell them it was an accident, okay? McInnes said nothing for a long moment. Finally, he said, okay. Promise? Dun Dunn said. But McInnes said nothing because he was dead. And I just, to me, that's set up so brilliantly. So he speaks in the previous line. He says nothing, and then he says, okay. And then Dun Dun says promise, but McInnes said nothing. So even then, you still feel like he could then say something, but then the next line is because he was dead. So I just think, like, from a craft perspective, that was brilliantly set up to be a shocking twist. Like, not twist, but like just a moment of like, we expected this guy to be alive, and then all of a sudden he's just not. He just dies. And then they decide that, like, well, now that he's dead, we're just gonna like kick him out of the car and not go in.
And I think that when they said from the moment that they said he was dead, there was like a switch that was flipped, and they were like, all right, just dropping him out, like push him out of the car. I'm kind of glad that he's dead because he gave me that fuckhead nickname, and like all of these things are kind of it just kind of was this like flipped moment. But I have a question for you, and then I also want to say a line from the story. Do you think Dun Dun shot him on purpose? Because we see here at the end, there's like a little epilogue type thing where it says like he like tortured somebody for something, and then he beat a man almost to death. And it's like, do you think that there was an argument or something that happened that caused him to shoot the man?
Yes, I do. And whether or not he intended to hit him or if he intended to shoot next to him to frighten him or something, I don't think it's possible to know. So I think that's the ambiguity, is like, did he actually intend to shoot him, or did he intend to shoot his gun at him and maybe scare him, and then he accidentally hit him? But either way, yeah, we see that Dun Dun is a violent dude. And it's interesting because the story wants us to find his humanity, though. And he says, like, I can feel like you don't like him from the way I'm describing him, but he was actually a good dude. Like, he's kind of telling us, And that just underlines everything about this book. It's like everybody we meet, no matter how reprehensible the shit they're doing, this book tries to find their humanity, and it's like nobody is a villain in this book, right? They're all just people.
Yeah, and there's this line here that I wanted to read that's talking about just that. So the narrator says, basically to set it up, he's saying like, yeah, Dundun is like a messed up guy, and then he goes on to say, but moving around a soldering iron in your brain will change you too. So basically saying like what the drugs have done to his brain is just like taking a soldering iron and shove it in there and mess up some of your some of your components.
For sure. Yeah, and that goes back to what you were talking about with this whole martyr idea, right? Because I feel like every one of these stories is showing our main characters like sinning and living a life of, depravity, right? And yeah, I like that though. Like it's a compounding and showing us that he's done a lot of terrible things and been around a lot of terrible things. Yeah,
and then I think the question that comes up continuously is like forgiveness from that. It's like, can these characters be forgiven? Can Dundun be forgiven for killing that guy? Can our narrator be forgiven for a number of things?
Does he deserve to be forgiven? Yeah.
Okay, so the next one is work. Our narrator and a friend strip a house of old copper for money.
Yeah. Okay, that's your. Yeah. This story was really cool to me. It's him and this guy, and they go out and they strip this house that's in. It's almost like a ruin. It's like a housing subdivision that went up and then it flooded, and so all the houses got abandoned and they're just like these leftover husks of homes. And they're out there and they're in this house stripping it of wire, and our narrator asks him, he says, whose house do you think this was? And the guy says, it's mine. And so we come to find out that like apparently he had bought this, or who knows. And then there's this crazy moment where they're working, and then all of a sudden a woman, like they hear a sound of a boat, and they look out the window and they see this boat coming down like a canal or something. And there's a woman on a kite, and she's completely nude. And they just like fly by, and there's this really funny moment where they're like, what's she doing up there? And then they're like, but it was obvious she was flying.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's so surreal, right? And then after that, they leave the house and they're going to go with their money, and they stop along the way at this like random house out on the side of the road, and they go in, and our narrator realizes that this is the wife of the man he's with, and he has another awesome moment where he says, it was like I had stumbled into his dream. Like I was in his dream about his life with his house and his like ex-wife and all this stuff.
And honestly, I thought that like the drugs were doing that to him. I thought that like he was somehow like his trip or his like his high that he had was like putting him into somebody's dream, and we were getting that crazy perspective. Because how else how is she on a kite?
Yeah, it was a very melancholy and sad story. But I really loved this one.
I actually felt like we had some happiness in here for a very specific reason.
You said it was a happy moment.
I like the work aspect of it, right? So these are people who are running around, like you said, their life is chaos. They're constantly doing things that like to society is just like anti-society, basically.
Yeah,
they're just
stealing from people.
Yeah. So to see this moment of them like going and doing like hard labor, and our narrator like huffing and puffing, and he's like dying, he needs water, and they're really like working and putting in like a kind of an honest day's work, even though it's clearly not.
Well, I mean, it's called work for a reason too, because I think you're right on, yeah.
So there at the end, they're able to they like basically like, they're constantly living with like this guilt of like because they're not, like I said, they're anti-society, so they're not doing what society would have them do if given the opportunity. So like they're using drugs that are illegal, they're stealing from people, they're doing all these things, but this day, after this hard day of work, they felt like they earned whatever they were going into. So like they earned their drinking, they earned their potentially drugs. And I thought that was interesting because it's kind of like an addict seeing like the light through the trees and seeing like, maybe I could have made a go at this, or maybe I still can, and like just like have an honest worker's mentality if I could just get away from this drug.
Yeah, and that's a whole like line of philosophical thought about that too. Sisyphus pushing the rock, and you have to imagine that he was happy. And so you can be happy in labor and in the thing you're doing. So I think that there is definitely something about that. Something this started bringing up to me and was starting to really solidify in my mind as we were reading is how fucked up our main characters' views are on women. and the women that he's with. And because to me, he always treats them like they are there to save him. He treats them like they're otherworldly creatures, often comparing them to like divine figures,
Right.
Or like mothers to him. He really, I mean, and like it fits the character, and because this is a character who wants to be saved, and I think he goes into almost every relationship he has, like looking to be saved from someone or by someone.
Yeah.
And so it's always doomed to fail because often the people he's with are just as fucked up as he is.
Right. Okay, so the next one is Emergency, and I think you're going to read the synopsis for this one, right?
Well, I don't have a synopsis, but I just know this story really well. So this is, I believe, the most famous story from this book. It's definitely the one I've read the most. And so basically we got Fuckhead, and he has another orderly named Georgie. Hey, it's like episode 1 all over again.
I know, I thought about that.
And they're these two guys, and they're working in like at a hospital. They're orderlies, and they're both just out of their minds on drugs, especially, Georgie at first, and then our main character gets some from him. And Georgie's like cleaning up blood that's not there anymore, and he's just out of his mind. And then this guy comes in with a hunting knife stuck through his eye all the way to the hilt. And he just walks in, and they're like, "How did you get here?" And he's like, "Oh, I walked over." And he's totally calm. And they bring him back, and they're like, "Oh, we need to get you like sitting down." And he's like, "I think I'd be ready for something like that." I don't know. This is something that's just genuinely funny and crazy. Mm-hmm. And then like in a dark way, obviously. And then they buzz the doctor, and they're like, "Oh, we got a surprise for you," and exam room, whatever. And he shows up, and then he like freaks out, and he's like, "We're gonna get the best damn brain doctor. We're gonna get." And they're having this conversation in the other room, and they tell the orderly to go like prep him and get him cleaned while they're like talking about it. And they're talking about they're gonna get the best gas man to come in, and like the guy's like going crazy because he's in way over his head. He doesn't know what to do.
Right.
And then Georgie comes walking into the room, and he's just holding the knife. And it's so absurdly funny to me and crazy. I don't know, that was to me laugh out loud funny. In a really dark way. I don't know. Maybe because I've read the story enough times. The first time I think I was just shocked, but how did that part play for you?
Well, I mean, I thought it was hilarious. I loved it too. The thing that kills me is that and that's something I should say, honestly, with this story, I found myself rereading so many times to try to really understand what was being said. Yeah. And like, because it's so all over the place sometimes.
Well, and I told you for this one, I was like, specifically, I told you to get the physical copy and not to do the audiobook. Because I think that is the way to read this, where you can really go back and digest these things.
Yeah, and so like so when he first came out, I was trying to understand if the guy had pulled the knife out on his own or if Georgie had done it. And then so once I realized Georgie had done it, it was really funny to me. But this story is like, I think this is my favorite story from this because I think it's like the perfect like the perfect meld of like all the different stories in one, because we get this crazy absurdness that goes on, and it's like kind of like how that guy shouldn't even be alive anymore. So it's like the surreal absurdist stuff. And then we get this other story where they leave.
But then she says like, she's like, the nurse keeps saying like, it's one of those things because like we've all heard about stuff like this actually happening.
Right.
Like those crazy medical stories of people who are just fine from some ridiculous injury.
Yeah.
Right. And like the guy doesn't even like lose his eye somehow. Right. Like he can still see out of it.
Yeah. So then they leave. Right.
Yeah. So they leave. They go driving out, and I forget where they're going, but they hit a rabbit. And he's like, "What was that?" And he's like, "Oh, it was a rabbit." And they pull over, and he's like, she's like, "We'll cook it, and we'll feast on its haunches, and we'll breakfast on it in the morning," or something like that. And then, they find the rabbit. It was pregnant, and so it's full of all these baby rabbits. And then this like other car drives up, and they're like, "Is that a snake?" And he's like, "No, it's a rabbit. And it's got babies." And then like that other car, just like there's like a full family. They just all drive off. And then he gives it over to Fuckhead, and he's like, "Here, you hold them. We gotta go. We gotta get them milk. We gotta get them sugar." He's like, "We killed the mother, but we're gonna save the babies." And Georgie's all excited again. And so we see Georgie like behaving really, I think it's really fascinating to think about how Georgie's behaving versus how our main character is.
For sure.
And so then they go and they get stuck in like a blizzard, not a blizzard, like a snowstorm. And they end up being at a drive-in. They walk to a drive-in, and he has this hallucination where he feels like he's in a graveyard and he's seeing angels, but he's actually in this drive-in. And then come to find out, he just like sat on all the babies and squished them because he forgot about them, essentially. Which is great. Like, I just want to know, like, what you were thinking throughout this story.
That's what I'm trying to say. Like, it was so, this is like the Lynchian stuff. Like, I was like, I can't predict anywhere that any of this is going in any way.
Right.
And it was just like, what does this mean? What is this for? So like going back and trying to find meaning, like what does a rabbit have to do with like what's going on here? And like the drive-in theater, I was like, what the theater? It's like the graveyard and like, it's just so much.
Oh, so we also see Georgie, he has this hunting knife now. He calls it his hunting knife. Yeah. He doesn't know where he got it. And then at the end, we see the guy who came in with the knife he's getting checked out, and he meets Georgie, and Georgie doesn't even know who he is. He's like, who are you supposed to be? So the story ends with them picking up like a hitchhiker who they knew, and they're gonna who's AWOL from the war, and they're gonna take him to Canada. But the guy asks Georgie, "What do you do for a job?" And Georgie says, "I save lives," which is where the story ends.
So my question and the things that I was thinking about is just Georgie as a character and like what this means, because he kind of talks about at one point, he's like, when they were like taking the babies out, he's like, I should have been a doctor, I should have been a surgeon or whatever, right. And like. Is he just insanely lucky, or is this a commentary on like is he like a genius, or like not necessarily genius, but is he just like so like he could have had all like the things that he could have been if he wasn't an addict, the things that he could have done, or is he just incredibly lucky all throughout?
I think he's deluded a little bit in thinking that he could do these things. I don't think he would make a good doctor.
But I'm saying, do you think that the commentary is that like if he wasn't, maybe he could have done these things?
Maybe. What I do think is going on is that Georgie genuinely wants to be a better person in this moment. He wants to be heroic. He wants to save the rabbits. And maybe he's super fucked up, just like our main character, in like almost every single way, right? Like they're very close. He says there's one major difference between us. And I think at this point in the story, at least, our main character has not yet decided he wants to be a better person. But I think Georgie does. Mm-hmm. And I think that, and maybe that's like a lesson here that he learns, or that maybe we start to see that rub off on him throughout the rest of the book. Because yeah, I think that's the key difference, is that Georgie wants to do the right thing. He's totally fucked up, and he's on drugs, and he's messing things up and doing things the wrong way. And, but yeah, I think he ultimately has a good heart, and he wants to help, and he wants to do the right thing, and he wants to be heroic. And that's not something we've really gotten out of our main character.
Yeah.
So back to sort of the absurdity of life and trying to find meaning, right? To me, the rabbit is sort of like a microcosm of that, because it's this random tragedy that happens, and we immediately see Georgie trying to find meaning. And the first thing he does is he tries to find meaning in sort of like the natural order. Like, mm-hmm. I have slain this rabbit, and now I'm going to eat it, and it's going to sustain me, and it's going to be this like a hunter, or like a predator in the wild. It's going to be natural, right? But then when he sees it has babies, it shifts, and now he's going to save the babies and let the mother die, and then that is sort of like a doctor, like you said, And so for me, this is Georgie like actively trying to do it, and he sort of enlists our narrator, and he says, "You're going to help me in this. We're going to do this together." And once again, our narrator's just kind of along for the ride, and he's like, okay, yeah, I'll do it. But then he ends up fucking it up, and Georgie yells at him, and he's like, everything you touch goes to shit. Like why do you fuck everything up? Like, mm-hmm. Fuckhead's a good name for you. And he gets mad at him, right?
Yeah.
And our narrator's like, yeah, it's true. He's like, I'm not arguing with you. I agree with you. He says I agreed with you before you even said that. Like, I preemptively agreed with you. And so that's kind of how our narrator is. Like, he feels like he is beyond forgiveness, and he's not a good person.
Like I said before, I feel like I need to reread this story already because of a couple of details that I have now. Not this story, this entire book, because I when I was reading it, I wasn't thinking of it chronologically. So I thought this is a random moment in time. So right. To think of it as like this is the moment where maybe we see a turn in our main character to him being more compassionate. I'm
not 100% sure that like every story after this definitely comes after this. But I do think it falls on a timeline in which maybe this is a turning point for him. Maybe.
Yeah. Well, and so I saw it more as a standalone turning point. Like, it's like a moment where he realized like he should be good, and I think he sees Georgie as like this beacon. Like, he's clearly like wanting to be a good person, wanting to do the right thing. And I think that the drugs for both of them, because how much easier would it be for Georgie to be a better person if he wasn't on the drugs? I think it's just continuously making it so that our characters are realizing that like if they were able to get off the drugs. But then again, I don't see any sort of want in them to get clean in this story, at least.
I don't think they've yet connected drugs to the problems of their lives. I think that's something that early on and through much of this story, drugs are just another avenue for them to escape. And right. I don't think it's interesting because like the idea of him at some point, he just is in rehab, I think. And I think this to me is like the only thing that makes me think like I can see why maybe he goes that route, or the work story maybe. But yeah, we don't get those exact thoughts like, now I'm going to go to rehab for this reason. We never get that. But yeah, let's move on. We got more stories to get through.
Okay, so the next one is Dirty Wedding. The narrator likes to ride trains. He tells 3 stories about people. One about taking his girlfriend for an abortion, the other about a man in a laundromat, and finally he meets a girl on the train who takes him to find drugs.
Yeah. So this is a really dark story. It leads off with him taking his girlfriend to get an abortion. And to me, this is like, because we just had this sort of high point, and like I said, like this, to me, this is the complete opposite direction. Mm-hmm. And, maybe he's saying something about life being messy in that way too. Like there are no, like in our lives, it isn't just like an arc that you can trace. It is more up and down. And because we see, to me, he's almost at one of his most reprehensible moments here with how he's behaving and how little responsibility he's taking for anything.
Well, and there's like a couple of different stories going on in this story, and the abortion clearly is the one that is I think the most important to this story. But there's also like his suppressed sexuality that we're getting a touch of, and we're also getting like
maybe. I wasn't clear about that. Yeah, because there's a moment where he has like an erection when he's followed this guy to a place, and but then the guy, he also seems like he looks like Jesus, or he feels like he's Jesus.
I think he's just saying like Jesus on the cross type thing, like there's something about like religion there again. But there's a moment where he like takes his shirt off. I think that triggers the erection in him. So like that's like why he followed this guy, because he's like realizing like because he's surprised by his attraction to this guy, and then we get a little bit of it later too. But that one is like, I think that was planting the seeds for a later story. But it's just interesting to me that in this story about abortion, we're also getting something potentially about his sexuality. But we go into this portion where what I saw was like due to grief, potentially the abortion, and then other life choices, his girlfriend or his wife, I think it's his girlfriend at this point, she ends up with another guy, and then she overdoses and like leaves him a note on his pillow. But
then he's just as fucked up as she is, that's a recurring thing in this book, like looking for help from someone who's just as bad a situation as you are.
And maybe that's saying something about addiction being selfish too. There's something about like using in general, maybe not necessarily the addiction side to it. You're looking out for yourself. And maybe it's like even in Car Crash where he saves the baby, that was like a rare moment, but then he just goes to the semi and sits in the semi instead of continuing to help.
Well, he doesn't even know why he has the baby. He's like, he doesn't even know why. He's like, he just has it.
Right.
And so I like that. And I think there's something about like these people trying to rely on each other, and then the tragedy being that like they are unable to provide anyone else with anything when they're so caught up in their own shit and their own like you said, like sort of like selfish addictions and like their own lives, and they're just trying to find their own ways. And then when someone tries to rely on them, like we see so many characters letting people down in this book, right? Like left and right. Mm-hmm. And it leads to people dying. Like it's tragic.
Yeah. We get the thing at the end where our narrator's talking about abortion, and he's talking about what scientists and people will argue about, like when the baby is alive, and kind of his argument is that it's not necessarily about like basically that's wasted time in talking about like when the baby is alive. It's just like the effect that either having or not having that baby is going to have on the baby and also their lives.
Yeah, so I'm gonna read that paragraph because I think there's a lot going on there. Here's the final paragraph of this one where we've learned that the girlfriend died from overdose, and then we also learned that the new boyfriend ends up committing suicide, which I think also shows, because like the whole time he's been talking about how much he loved his girlfriend, but when she dies, it's the new boyfriend that ends up killing himself basically out of grief.
Yeah.
Not him. So once again, it's like he isn't quite there. Like he isn't quite, I don't know, like he's less than somebody else, right? Like we see often happen again. Anyway, so here's the final paragraph where he's talking about the abortion in particular. I know they argue about whether or not it's right, whether or not the baby is alive at this point or at that point in its growth inside the womb. This wasn't about that. It wasn't what the lawyers did. It wasn't what the doctors did. It wasn't what the woman did. It was what the mother and father did together. I don't know that he's trying to make any statements about abortion here to me. To me, this is like him saying, I don't know about all that, but this story isn't about that. It's about the mother and father and what they did together. So like the whole, like creating the baby and going through with everything that happened in their lives and putting themselves in a situation where this was their lives. And that I think is like, that's the point of the story, not necessarily like trying to get into it. And it's interesting though, because there is a moment in the story too, where he talks about like the ghost of the unborn child. He could feel like in the, like around him or something. It's like a surreal moment too. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting because this is a couple stories in here where like, this is an extremely loaded topic, right? And this is going to be a very, you know, people, whoever you are listening to this now, you have an opinion about this and you probably very strongly held. And I, you know, and I don't know what's, you know what I mean? Like, who knows? I have my own opinions about it, but I don't know if they're right. And I think that's what Denis Johnson is saying here. Like, he's like, I don't know if I'm right or what, or who's right in this discussion, but this story I'm telling you is more about us as people than it is about the abortion itself, I guess. And what, maybe it's like what led to it.
And I think he's saying like what happened after. Okay, so the next one is The Other Man. The narrator meets a traveling man, and only after hanging out does he find out that he lied about being Polish originally, and then he finds out that this guy's actually from Cleveland. He's like a traveling salesman or something like that. And then the story moves to Seattle, where he's going to meet friends, and then he meets him on the Sound, which is the like body of water in Seattle.
Okay. And then they're like on a ferry or something, and then they go into town and they go to a bar called Kelly's and they have drinks together.
Right.
Continue.
So then after that story is done, and basically what he doesn't realize is that in the moment he doesn't realize that this guy's actually like making a pass at him, like trying to come on to him. And he doesn't realize this, but the way he describes it is like, I would tell people this story later, and they would tell me like, clearly this guy was trying to come on to you, and you didn't realize that. Which again, we'll talk about that. But he talks about how he's trying to meet friends in Seattle, and he's not able to meet up with them. So then he goes to a bar and he meets a girl and ends up like hooking up with her and having this interesting.
Or that's when he goes to Kelly's. Actually, that's when he goes to Kelly's. The other one was a different bar. I forget. I don't know what it was named. Yeah, so he meets a girl, and then she's married, but then they end up going back to her place anyway and like hooking up
and like lying or something and saying that he's like related.
But it's also like this really kind of, again, it's talked about as like this really magical way where he says the torn moon mended and our fingers touched away the tears, and he says it was there, which I thought was also really like kind of ambiguous, like what was there.
I think that to me was them having sex. Like that was them like all of those things like pointed me to like them having sex. But maybe I don't know. Did you get something different?
Well, I think it's more than that, because to me, a lot of these random hookups and stuff, it's like these two broken people, like, and she finds out that she had just gotten married like a few days before, and clearly this is a fucked up situation, and she's like got her own issues. And and like the way that they're like talking about like tears and their sort of like attraction to each other, I don't know. There's something sort of like almost like chemistry, like a reaction happening. And then when they're together, it's like a really powerful and fleeting moment that they both know is fleeting. Yet there's like a certain, they can come together and like share a moment and feel alive and maybe feel a little bit better just for a short amount of time. And that also shows to me how a lot of his romantic relationships are much like drugs to him, too. Yeah. Right. But I wanted to back up a little bit. So we went to Seattle last time you were here. And we hung out on St. Patrick's Day at a bar in Seattle. And I want to say that bar was called Kelly's.
Really?
It was like a Irish bar. Do you remember?
I remember the bar. I just don't remember the name of it.
I'm like picturing it, and I swear to God it was called Kelly's. It might not be. I might be completely wrong. But when I read this story, I was like, holy shit, it's the same place.
That's
so
awesome.
I felt like it was the same place, which I thought was pretty crazy. Because we literally spent St. Patty's Day like at the bar, getting like, we were drinking like Irish whiskey. We talked to some random dude. Like my sister was here too, and like it was this crazy night. And when I was reading the story, I totally thought of it.
Yeah, that was a fun night.
How crazy would it be if
that would be crazy if it was the same place? That would be insane. We got to figure that out.
We got to look that
up.
But
I also wanted to jump back for the story really quickly because I wanted to talk about something that I thought was really great with the form of or like just the planning of the story, even though it seems like it's not planned. There's a story earlier on that we read. I think it's the fourth one or the third one, called Two Men, and it's and it's about the mute man, and the way that the story ends, it like kind of just abruptly ends, and we only ever hear about one man. And the way that this story starts, this story is called The Other Man, and the way that this story starts is he's like, but he finished the story that was before this, so there's been like 3 or 4 in between, and he's like, but I haven't finished telling you about the two men. I've only told you about the first one. And then so he starts the story off by talking about the guy who was coming on to him that was saying that he was Polish, but he was from Cleveland.
Which also was like crazy and funny. Like he was like, he had all these crazy stories about Poland he was telling, and then he goes to the bathroom and then he comes back out and he's like, man, I'm just from Cleveland. Did you see that? Like, did you see that coming at all? Like I took it totally at face value. No like I thought this guy was legit.
No, I thought, I agree. I thought it was legit. And I also didn't realize until he said anything about the coming on to him thing. So what does that mean for the story? That's my question. Because the sexuality was brought up right before this, and then it seems that like he's like maybe repressing, like he's actively not seeing signs of somebody coming on to him. Is that just his obliviousness, or is that him like actively not engaging with something that he might see subliminally or something, or maybe like in the back of his mind?
I think he has trouble differentiating between romantic interest and just like human interest. And he has trouble in his own life with that. Whenever he meets a woman, I think he if he's ever interested in a woman, he is then like also immediately romantically interested in the woman, right? Like he can't differentiate with the two. And so for here, I remember he was very interested in this guy who was from Poland, and he had this new rental car, and he was out and he was enjoying his life, and he was like, I just really wanted to be him. And he was just really attracted to this guy's humanity. And so I think when he saw what that kind of being reflected and the other guy was like giving it back to him, he didn't realize that this guy was seeing something romantic, in my opinion. Because I think he has difficulty differentiating what those two things look like. And I don't know, like you keep saying repressed sexuality, and maybe, I think there's definitely a way you can read this book and see that. I guess that what didn't occur to me that it was happening that way, but maybe it is. Yeah, I don't know. You ready for happy hour?
Yes, let's do happy hour next. So my synopsis here is the narrator recounts going to happy hours and then takes drugs with a belly dancer who he likes.
Yeah. So this is there's a really interesting moment where he goes to a library and he feels sort of like crushed by all these words around him, right? And so this was me going like, oh, this character, I was like, this is a version of Denis Johnson who isn't a writer, and who Denis Johnson, when he was having a lot of these same struggles, turned to writing and found meaning through that and was able to describe his world through his language. And then I quickly abandoned that because we later see the character saying he's a writer. But in this moment, it made me feel that way. And maybe this is a point in his life where he hadn't decided to become a writer yet. I don't know. Yeah. But to me, like, if you think of writing as just another one of those things where he's like looking for meaning, and maybe that's something that sort of saved him and pulled him out of this, was like his own art, which I think is interesting to think about. I didn't know his backstory when I was reading it, but I totally see that now. Like it definitely seems to be something that, like, I mean, I don't know when he started writing, but clearly he became a successful writer after dealing with addiction or something like that. Like that you have to pour yourself into something in order to avoid the addiction. So I think it's got to have been writing. So he said that during his addiction, which was like his entire 20s, mm-hmm. He published, I think he said like 20 or 30 poems and a handful of short stories. So that's not nothing.
Right.
So he was publishing, but he said over the course of 10 years, that was all he did. So he didn't feel like that was a lot. And then as soon as he got clean, he went on to have like the most prolific time of his career. He wrote this book. He wrote his one that went on to win the awards. He wrote plays and stuff. So I think he does feel like his addiction was definitely keeping him from being creative.
Right. So the next one's Steady Hands at Seattle General. The story here is the narrator is in a detox center talking to another man about the future.
Yeah, so this is what I was talking about. He's just all of a sudden he's in rehab now. And I think at the end of the last story, he's like taking a pill of like mushrooms or something, right? So he's doing more drugs.
So I have a question though. I'm not familiar enough to know, but is detox, is that full on rehab, or is that just like to keep you from like, is that like you have to get off, like you have to wean your body off of it because it like your body needs certain chemicals?
I don't know. I definitely don't know the difference between all of those. It may be exactly what you said. I don't know, but it does remind me that this story. It's very clear that he's like just doing this for the first time. But what's cool is that, or what was interesting was that he liked it. He was like, I really like this place. Yeah. They give me like really good drugs, and I feel really good here. And like, he was happy, right? And he's talking to this guy, and they have this awesome conversation where he says, "I'm going to write about this in a poem or a story. How should I describe you?" The guy's like, "I'm fat." And he's like, "Well, no, I'm going to write about this. Tell me how you want me to describe you." And he's like, "Just say I'm fat."
No.
Like,
he says,
I'm going to describe you that way. And then like you're reading. Go ahead.
He's like, no, he's like, at first he says he's fat, and then he's like, "But I'm going to write about you in the story or whatever." And he's like, "Then say I'm overweight."
Yeah. And I just love it because it's like, we're reading that. So it just feels so right? Like he really had this conversation with this guy, and he just put it in there verbatim. Like, this is the conversation we had about it.
Yeah.
And then I love this. I forget. Is he like shaving this guy? I forget exactly what he's doing.
Shaves a mustache at one point. Yeah.
He's like shaving his mustache or something, and he sees that the guy has like a bullet hole through one cheek, and then like an exit wound in the other cheek that's like bigger. And then we find out this guy's been shot like multiple times by his wives over the years. And he's like not as enthused about being here, and he's like, "Yeah, man, I've been here. I'm older than you. I've been here a bunch of times. It's fucked up." And then I took a picture of the end of this story, and I put it on our Instagram, and it's because I absolutely love the way it ends. I'll back up a little bit and give you a little more on this on the Instagram. Here we go. This is the end of that story when they're just talking about whether or not they're going to be okay. "I could see you living here 2 weeks out of every month. Well, I'm older than you are. You can take a couple more rides on this wheel and still get out of here with all your arms and legs stuck on right. Not me. Hey, you're doing fine. Talking to here. Talking to your bullet hole? Talking to my bullet hole. Tell me I'm fine." So I just love that exchange. Talking to my bullet hole. It's like this. It's like an older version of himself, right?
Yeah.
Who's maybe not. Like, it's like, is this the first moment where you've met somebody who like maybe is more pessimistic about life than our main character? Because up until now, he has always been like the most fucked up, most pessimistic person in the room, I feel like.
Yeah, and I think this is our main character if he doesn't get clean. Like, I think that's
right.
That path. Like, maybe this is a moment where he realizes like this guy's this way, and it's like a motivational thing for him going forward to be clean.
So what's also great about it is that the bullet hole is a scar, and it's proof of it's like the leftover thing about something that happened in his life. And even if you move on, even if this guy moves on in his life, like, he's always going to have that scar. And I think that's what he's saying when he says, speaking to my bullet hole or whatever, because like, he's always going to have this now. And so just the idea of that, like, I think that's true. It's like, as much as our main character is trying to move on from his sins, like, he's not going to be able to ever fully move on from them. Like, there's things that you can't escape. Like, it is your past now. And then so in some senses, it's like, it's been written and it can't be unwritten, right? I guess.
Well, and it's also like, he says like, "You're going to be okay." And he's like speaking to my bullet hole. And it's like, I think that's his way of saying like, I'm already not okay. Like it's not like I can like become.
This is proof that I'm not okay. Yeah.
So this is the last one here, and it's Beverly Home. The narrator works in a care facility, and he peeps in on a Mennonite couple on his way to work each day. He's also working on being sober and finds a community with others.
Yeah. So this story takes a turn here. I totally wasn't seeing coming. I felt like he was really he was doing well. He's working at this place, and he goes around. I don't know if it's his job, but part of the thing he does there is he touches people, which at first sounded creepy to me, but then it's like, it actually, I think, is really sweet almost.
Yeah, it's
these
very
people
interesting.
who just like don't get human contact. And he just like, touch their arms, like rub their hair or whatever. And they all really enjoy it. And it's like, he's giving like contact to people. I love that he is like working somewhere with all these people who are cast out of society, whether they're elderly or they're crippled or they have some sort of problem. At one point, there's a character who has like cerebral palsy. And he says that like he's openly and honestly like fucked up now. He can't hide it anymore. Like the rest of us, basically. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting. It's almost like he's saying, like, I am like that on the inside, but this guy is like that on the outside.
Yeah, and he's in his own words referring to all these people as weirdos. So, and he sees,
including himself.
Himself, yeah. So he sees himself like becoming a part of this community and finding like a place where he belongs. And doesn't he end up like hooking up with a woman who has some sort of stroke or something?
He's with two different women in this story. The first one is a woman who has dwarfism, and he's dating her for a while, and it seems like there's like he's really intimate with her, yet there's this thing where they can't like have sex without like certain TV shows playing in the background, and then he's always gone in the morning before she wakes up or something. Yeah, because it seems like he's like afraid of some sort of intimacy with her, like he can't quite get to that point. Right. For whatever reason, I don't know. And then later on in the story, he ends up with a girl who's paralyzed, like half of her body's paralyzed. Mm-hmm. And that's like one of his most intense relationships he has. Right. And obviously there's a lot of thematic stuff here. He calls her crippled. And I think he's comparing her kind of exterior, her being half paralyzed to him, like he feels like he's crippled on the inside. Right. Like this is a guy who feels like he's broken. And then so what's going on throughout all of this and his personal growth and he's getting better is that he's also stopping every day, and at first he hears singing, he goes over and he like looks in somebody's bathroom window and sees a woman naked showering and just like peeps at her. And then he decides he's going to come back and do that again like every day. And then the husband comes home, and then he like gets away, right? And then he starts doing this every day. It becomes a habit. And he keeps seeing her, showering, and then he starts watching them together. And he finds out that they're some sort of very traditional religious couple, Mennonite, he believes. And then he becomes like obsessed with catching them having sex. Like he needs to see them have sex. And then literally there's a point where he thinks that they are having sex, but then it seems like maybe they weren't. They were actually having an argument, which I thought was interesting too, right? Like that kind of means something too. Mm-hmm. And then the husband washes her feet, and in the final, and then she also like throws open the blinds, and he's standing there, but then she doesn't see him because she can only see her own reflection. So that all to me feels like super heavy, loaded, symbolic stuff is going on.
For sure.
And I still feel like I'm trying to figure it all out. So I definitely wanted to know like what was going on there to you.
I think it had something to do with the religious aspect, obviously. I think that he is like, there's some representation here that I don't know that I can really make. I don't know if I have the knowledge to back it up, but I think like there's some sort of like he represents something like by staring in at their relationship, and he's like almost like violently wanting to see them have sex. And so it's like, is that like some sort of?
He even mentions at one point imagining himself raping her.
Yeah,
which was crazy.
And then when they're having their argument, he thinks they're having sex, and he wants to like bust the window so he can see, because he feels like he's being cheated. And so I think that it's like this really intense, like, I don't know if it's like a devil or like demonic symbolism or something, but I don't really have the background to make this argument, but I think there's definitely something there.
Yeah. So to me, just from the character, this is proof of like his bullet hole, right? Like he is scarred by the things that have happened to him. Right. And this is proof that he's still broken, even as he's in the process of healing. And that's why they say like, you're always, when you're an alcoholic, you're always an alcoholic. You're just an alcoholic who's in recovery. Mm-hmm. And to me, that's the thing. Like he could always backslide, and this is kind of him backsliding. He's at a meeting at one point, actually, and a guy says that he used to just walk around and he would like look in houses and he'd think about people's normal lives in there while he's just like carrying his sins behind him in like a wagon or something. And then that like upsets our narrator so much that he has to leave and like go outside and he's like dumbstruck by it.
Right.
And I think that's saying that like he recognizes that this is kind of what he's doing in this moment. And it's like something about this couple's life is so he can't understand it. And they have found peace through their belief in God. But then also they seem like so normal, and he like has to see them like fuck, because I think that would show that they're human and not just like some sort of like otherworldly creature, which is kind of what he like views them as, like some otherworldly beings.
And I think that there's something there about like the purity of like I don't know if it's abstinence or like maybe, but like just the act of in his eyes the act of having sex is like somewhat like dirty or like or like there's something about it, and he wants to see this couple who is like pure potential, like in his eyes, like do something filthy or dirty. So
right, like he wants to like drag them down to his level in some way. Yeah. And then when she throws open the blinds and they're like face to face, and I was like, oh shit, this is the moment. But she doesn't see him. Mm-hmm. And she only sees her own reflection, and she's like upset. And it was very kind of theatrical, like she was kind of putting on a show for her husband to come and apologize. But yeah, and then he just stands there like he's like shocked, like he can't move, and he's just looking at her. And then the idea that like he's in darkness, mm-hmm. and she literally can't see him. I felt like that, I don't know, that means something to me about like people like that, or that part of society, like not understanding. And there's like a divide between that and the other side of society, the people who are struggling and people who are in his situation, and how there is sort of a disconnect there, and the two can't really see each other, or can't see each other in a healthy way, I guess. Right. I don't know. Yeah. Trying to just like figure out what that could possibly mean. That's just all out of my ass. I don't know.
It's all just like so it's so hard to interpret it. It's like you could draw so many things from it.
And that's the other thing. I'm sure there is a ton of like literary writing and academic papers and, you know, PhD theses that have been written about this book out there. And I didn't read any of them on purpose because I wanted to give my personal reaction to this. Like, it had been a long time since I'd read it, and a lot of these stories were just vague memories, other than like Emergency and Car Crash. There was a couple that I remembered really, really, really well, but most of them I didn't. So yeah, this was just kind of like my reaction and your reaction. Like, this is just what you thought. And I didn't want that to be completely influenced by all these other things that have been written about this book, because there's a lot out there, and I think this is a highly interpretive text, in my opinion. So I think you could very well read this book and get a lot of different stuff out of it than what we got.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, this was such a fun experience, and like I honestly genuinely think that I'm going to go out of my way to read a lot more stuff like this, because it's just unlike anything else. Yeah,
if you the listener, if you have any recommendations, like, so obviously since we really enjoyed this, if you have any books that you know that you would feel like are in the same realm as this, definitely send them our way, and especially if they have an adaptation, because that's kind of a requirement. We need that as an excuse to read them. But I mean, I'm also just curious about books, so you just tell me. All right, so I mentioned earlier, I really wanted to hear your take on how you might adapt something like this. And I do want to hear that, but I'm going to have you save it for like the very end, and that'll be the last thing we talk about.
Okay, cool. If you wanted to find us on social media, we're on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, all of those at Ink to Film. And we also have our Facebook group, Council of Inklings. Yeah, we wanted to thank S.K. Nash for becoming a patron. She was fairly recently. She's someone who I met at Worldcon. She was super nice, and I talked to her about the podcast, and she ended up following it. And yeah, she's a patron now. So thank you so much for supporting us. We really appreciate it. You help keep this thing going. And if you guys wanted to find out how to become a patron yourself, patreon.com/Ink2Film. You can find out about bonus episodes, special swag, different things we're offering. Check it out. If you wanted to help us out in another way, you could leave a rating or review on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And we wanted to thank Jennifer Delazana for doing our transcriptions. So I want to hear. So you are given the task. Let's not say you have to come up. You don't have to write the script. But what you do, you're going to work with the scriptwriter, and what he wants you to do
Let's say it's me. Yeah, I want you to tell me, how are we going to take these stories and just like briefly, just to get us started, how are we going to come up with a movie about this? How are we going to like possibly craft this into a cinematic tale?
So to me, and this is just like my perspective on books that I've read, this feels like a super experimental book. I feel like this isn't something that you normally do. So what I want to do is we got to dive into experimental filmmaking. We don't have to go quite as deep as like scratching, like taking film and scratching it and stuff like that to make it. But what I think is that it really
We're going full Lynch.
Yeah, I think that we need to. First of all, I think that we have to adapt it very closely. I would definitely try to make it feel like an anthology type thing. So like each one would have like its own title card, and then we go into it and it'd be like very formally like separated, but then also have those through lines showing up. But I also, and then the other thing is like from a form perspective, we definitely have to have, I don't know if you've seen like Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas.
Mm-hmm. I have.
There's like the scene where they're high, and like it's just like so surreal and so like you were saying, yeah, let's just go full Lynchian is what I'm trying to say, and just like let's like we have to
have drug sequences, and
yeah, we have to like be in the perspective of our narrator. So like let's just go like balls to the wall.
Are we going voiceover?
Oh, for sure, yeah.
Yeah, I think so too, because there's so many great lines in this book, and the way you can get them into this movie is to have our character thinking them. Because we can't possibly put them all in dialogue. It would be unnatural. But to have him thinking some of this shit, I think would be really compelling. All right, man, that sounds good to me. I'm going to be really curious to see what the movie, that was made, if they go that route at all, or if they go a completely different way. The only thing I know is that Jack Black is in it, and I believe he plays Georgie.
What I will say is that I don't think the movie that I just described would be financially successful, but I think it would be a lot of fun, and I think a lot of people would appreciate it.
Cool, man. Yeah, well, I'm excited to watch this movie now because I've never seen it. You've never seen it, so we're going in blind, and we really loved this book. I'm glad you loved it, too, because this was a really fond memory of me, a formative thing for me in my writing, was reading this book. So
it was awesome,
that I was able to talk about it with you.
Absolutely love this book.
All right, until next time.
Thanks for listening.